Hi there. So in my talk with Paul VanderKlay, he asked me, what is spirituality? And I had an awful hard time answering that because whatever answer you give to that question that isn't spirituality is a belief in God has a vagueness about it. And the best answer I could give at the time was, well, look at Frankl's noetic dimension. And then Paul said he might have to start referring to spirituality 1 and 2, the same as he refers to God 1 and 2. And in my understanding, God 1 is the non-theistic God, and number 2 is, of course, the theistic God. So I think that I'm referring to spirituality number 1, the non-theistic form of spirituality. So first let me discuss Frankl's noetic dimension. So Frankl's basically his manualization of his theory for therapy is logotherapy, from logos. But a lot of people have sort of tried to articulate this a little better with charts and graphs and lists and stuff. So I found this list that someone wrote based on what Frankl said about the noetic dimension. So the attributes of the noetic dimension, number 1 is responsibility, not from, but responsibility to. Number 2 is authenticity and creativity. Number 3 is choices. Number 4 is values. 5 is self-transcendence. 6 is will to meaning. 7 is love. 8 is conscience. And 9 is ideals, ideas, etc. I think I see spirituality a lot like quality in the sense that it's hard to define it, and that a list is not going to help too much because that's the analytical knife trying to carve up something that can't really be defined. And I would say in Frankl's case, these are observations of the outcome, maybe, of the noetic dimension. In the metaphysics of quality, what's on Frankl's list is a series of high-quality social and intellectual patterns. I guess I also see spirituality as best being able to detect quality when it emerges. That is a spiritual state, let's say. And so let's remember what Pirsig said about quality. Its origin is pre-intellectual, and we can't define quality. So the question is, if we can't define quality and we can't think it through since it's pre-intellectual, what are some of the ways to put ourselves in a position to, let's say, be better quality detectors? There is one thing, and it's a major thing about Frankl, and I think it can help with evoking a state that's better inclined towards receiving those pre-intellectual messages better. Helps us be a better quality detector. And that is a change of attitude, and that's a big thing in Frankl. So change of attitude. Even if we can't change a situation or circumstance, we can still choose our attitude towards a condition. This is often a self-transcending way of finding meaning, especially in unavoidable suffering. So to change your attitude is willfully making your point of view dynamic, because it's a change. It's willfully adding dynamism to your point of view. And that would be being prepared, looking for quality. I'm not saying this necessarily puts you in touch with dynamic quality, but I think it can help. It shakes you up to look for the good in maybe where you don't see it. And that is by definition a search for quality where there doesn't appear to be any, or where you don't really know what it is, when you put yourself in the mindset of trying to detect quality. In one sense, willfully looking for quality can actually help you find it. Another way that I see spirituality is when you feel like you are independent of the material world. That your core self, your essence, who you really are, is not contingent on what's going on in your experience. That you're connected to something bigger. And it's a connection to the ability to transcend, let's just put this in metaphysics of quality language, to transcend static patterns and connect with dynamic quality. Any discussion of non-theistic spirituality sounds kind of airy-fairy. It just does. As my best friend says, it sounds wind-chimey. And now I'm going to make it worse. I'm going to suggest that you look at Eckhart Tolle on Dave Rubin, and I would look at Dave Rubin's interview in particular, because Dave Rubin's a regular guy, and he's just, he's asking questions of Eckhart Tolle that just anyone would ask. A lot of times with Eckhart Tolle interviews, you have spiritual people asking these questions, but not Dave Rubin. So that's why I like that particular interview. Now, I know all about Eckhart Tolle being on Oprah all the time and being, sort of associated with that kind of New Age type thing. But I caution you not to dismiss him, because what he is doing is putting us in touch with what it's like to have a mystical experience and not get over it. There have been people in history who have had mystical transformations and have remained in that state. There's a couple Indian gurus, I've mentioned them before, Nisargadatta, Ramana Maharshi. These are two people of the 20th century who were considered to be like this, like in this mystical experience, and would articulate what it was like and help people, sort of develop that. Also some of the mystics in the past, some of the saints, John of the Cross was one of them, Teresa of Avila. So this mystical experience is an experience of the ground of reality, and it is there where you can, in metaphysics quality language, banish the ghosts of rationality, the rational worldview you've inherited, and you can begin to connect with what reality really is. Tolle is useful to help us understand what it feels like to be there, and like I've said, he's sort of a gateway drug to this kind of consciousness. And this kind of consciousness was cultivated by Pirsig with Zen meditation, for example. And of course, meditation is definitely probably the prime way to do this. I have to say, though, that I keep having this nagging feeling that even though you can cultivate spirituality, the ultimate spirituality is a belief in God. And I think that someone who believes in God doesn't have to go through all these mental gymnastics to figure out what spirituality is. And there's something to be said for that. Like I said, the jury's out for me. But it does kind of explain why in the Pageau-Vervaeke interview, Pageau was much more comfortable with this question than Vervaeke was, and why Paul VanderKlay was more comfortable with this than I was in the talk we had. So I want to read a comment from a viewer named Jeremy Firth, and he left this comment on the second video I made about the Vervaeke-Pageau dialogue. This was the one where I compared it to the metaphysics of quality, compared their worldviews to the metaphysics of quality. He writes, I came here after watching your video with Paul VanderKlay. I've been a Pirsig fan since I was a teenager. I was introduced to him by my father, who is also a big Pirsig fan. Now, I've actually heard that a lot from viewers, let's say in their 30s, who were introduced to Pirsig by their father's copy of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Considering your art background, especially coming up in the 80s when postmodernism was really hitting its stride in the art scene, I'm wondering how you could reconcile the idea that quality is innately recognizable and that our perceptions of quality are largely shared. You gave the example in this video of Phaedrus having students grade each other's papers, and how there was a consensus among them, with the idea that postmodernism seems to attack and upend what has historically been viewed or recognized, and especially canonized or venerated. In other words, it seems that the quality that Pirsig is writing about is more precious and more evasive than we might have thought before the current onslaught of postmodernism, where the entire classical value system is being challenged, ignored, and disrespected. I suppose on one level you could say that quality is like gravity. It doesn't actually care about what you think, it just keeps working. However, one's ability to perceive quality and engage with it and seek it is definitely malleable by our environment and by our culture, the boxcars. I think I'm interested but unable to articulate completely the challenge that postmodernism poses to the idea that the quality is essentially universal. Perhaps it's clearer to say that quality is universal, but the perception of quality is definitely scalar and individualized, yes. The problem with that, however, is where I think you and I are in a similar position. How can I be sure that what I'm pursuing or perceiving is quality and not some pseudo-quality that looks reassuring but won't hold up to scrutiny, or worse, wreck my life? Okay, this is a very good question. You could even say it's an essential question when you are contemplating how the metaphysics of quality can, how you can live using the metaphysics of quality to inspire and inform you. I sort of tried to answer this to an extent earlier with referring to Eckhart Tolle and meditative practices, in which we can find ways that better connect us to, let's say, that instant the quality originating in the pre-intellectual becomes known to us. The moment, for example, that the right mathematical fact emerges for Poincaré. It's the moment of recognition. Another way of helping to perceive quality and not some pseudo-quality is to read these two books and get a sense of what Pirsig's metaphysics feel like when they are informing you. This is directly from the source. These books are in essence a finger pointing to the moon, especially Lila. And I think that's why Pirsig chose the novel form, because that sort of gives a sort of a narrative, a parable, a fable of someone in the pursuit of quality. And we can sort of put ourselves in that position to a certain degree. The more you understand what Pirsig was saying, the more you can get into that mindset that gets you aligned with your quality detector. But here's the thing, you cannot do it rationally. So again, listening, reading, they prime you, but the actual quality detection can't be found in any book, ritual, or list, or a practice. The ability to better align with quality might be the result of the practice, and you might be able to detect quality by being real with yourself also. So what I mean by that is something like what Jordan Peterson says about articulating the truth. He says you have to be really honest with yourself about what you believe to be true. And you'll know this by the way it feels. This isn't necessarily objective truth. Truth can be dynamic. There's a pragmatic sense to this truth. It's contextual. But it's what you feel to be true at the moment, and feel in a real sense, embodied truth. It's a lot like Carl Rogers' congruence, which is where Peterson got this idea of embodied truth to a large degree. And for Rogers, and I love this way of looking at it, congruence is that what you think, feel, say, and do all are the same. So think about that. So let's try to answer this question about postmodernism and art. And one particular viewer who is helping me more deeply understand the metaphysics of quality introduced this concept of the metaphor to me in the metaphysics of quality. So dynamic quality is that pre-intellectual awareness of quality, and that pre-intellectual awareness will make its way into consciousness. When it becomes conscious, our compulsion, and we have this compulsion toward the better, is to manifest that quality. And how we manifest that quality in experience is with metaphor. The metaphor, and the metaphor can come in many forms, and I'll give an example. The metaphor is a contextual expression of that quality. So first, a little art history. When art changed, and let's say for the sake of simplicity, it was with Impressionism. Technically, it's a little earlier than that. But there was a genius Brujo. I'm linked to my Brujo video at the end to explain that concept. A genius Brujo named Monet, who got this feeling in his gut that he wanted to paint the experiential feeling, the impression of light on haystacks in the field rather than haystacks in the field, just a representation. All sorts of things that were happening that might have been, let's just say, his boxcars behind that leading edge of quality that follows the track of quality that emerged in that eureka moment. It was cultural things that were happening in the world. There was a variety of things for Monet particular in his boxcars that would have led to this. That eureka moment, that leading edge of quality is totally new and totally fresh, and it is the hallmark of the metaphor of dynamic quality. In this case, the dynamic quality is the notion to that emerges, the way dynamic quality emerges consciously in Monet is the notion to paint the light rather than the thing. And that manifests for Monet in the painting. So the painting of the impression of light on the haystacks is the metaphor of that moment of insight. And that metaphor lines up with congruence to the dynamic quality that he sensed. That's what makes it fresh. Like I said, freshness is the hallmark of dynamic quality and of the emerging high-quality static patterns that are those metaphors produce. In this case, it was Impressionism. So time goes on and Impressionism loses its freshness. Modern art continues along the lines of abstracting the feeling from the object rather than its representation. So early non-representational art, like just say at the turn of the 20th century by the Delaunays, still had some contact with experience. So those non-representational paintings of the Delaunays were supposed to be depictions of music. Then after World War I, after World War I, which was such a profoundly horrific, devastating thing that really destroyed everything that Europe thought they were. So Dada, the art of the absurd, emerges from that experience. So even before postmodernism, in fact, postmodern thinks they're very clever in this sense, but Europe was already deconstructing art. And then art becomes an abstraction. Of that abstraction, it starts to become a rational game of referring to itself rather than a metaphor of experience. This goes on for a while. And you eventually have abstract art, which is abstract for the sake of abstraction, such as Jackson Pollock. Once you have a white canvas on a museum wall, that's pretty much the nail in the coffin. That's the end of that. Anything of interest after that is novel in the sense of being individual expression. But the paradigm shift, the novel paradigm shift of modern art is over. And there's nothing of great significance, but there's a memory of that significance. So in the static pattern, that static pattern kind of consolidates around this memory, but it no longer takes in any dynamism. There's nothing else coming in. It's sort of an icon to itself at this point. And while at this point art is dead, the idea of abstracting away from experience has taken on a life of its own. And the way to maintain this closed off pattern is with ideology. That's the only way you can keep it going if you're not going to let in any dynamism. And it has been abstracted with rationality, with language, with theory. And it continues to self-abstract until every memory of quality fades. And this is a rigid, static pattern. There's no longer any dynamism. Postmodernism puts the final nail in the coffin with deconstruction, which says basically that aesthetic value is an illusion, that art ultimately doesn't have any quality, and that quality itself is a construction. So after that, the artists rationally set out to demonstrate that concept. Postmodern art is not a quality metaphor of dynamic insight. It's a rational idea of what is that original abstraction of the experiential feeling of the object rather than its representation. So postmodern, so now you have total rigid static pattern. There's nowhere to go with it. Art has been thoroughly deconstructed rationally. It can seem dynamic because of its shock value, but if you look at it, you see that it's dead, and you know it. The real shock was of the Dadaists and the Cubists in the 20s, when that was a reaction to the horrors of World War I, and that was a real dynamic paradigm shift. These so-called shock experiences are like zombies. They're like corpses. There's nothing in the Piss Christ that was not declared by Nietzsche and executed by the Dadaists. And since postmodern art is a rational idea. You know, the rational idea can actually cross over to a lot of things. You can force this idea on in numerous domains, and one domain, of course, is politics, is in intersectional politics, which in postmodernism is an abstraction of rights and justice for the oppressed. In postmodernism, this justice is theoretical. And that's why identity politics are such a mess. The actual oppressed people are nowhere to be found. Intersectionality has nothing to do with that spark of dynamic quality that caused those guys to sit down at the whites-only lunch counter at Woolworths. So the identitarians are advocating for the rights of abstractions of human beings and then enforcing their rigid, rational, static pattern on a dynamic world, and it does not work. Let me refer to a quote from chapter 11 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. His early failure had released him from any felt obligation to think along institutional lines, and his thoughts were already independent to a degree few people are familiar with. He felt that institutions such as schools, churches, governments, and political organizations of every sort tended to direct thought for ends rather than truth, and for the perpetuation of their own functions, and for the control of individuals and the service of these functions. So I've been watching a lot of Jonathan Pageau's work lately, and I was really pleased to see a video about postmodern art. There's a couple of them, but there's one in particular where he's sort of offering a solution to it. I think Jonathan has had a similar art school experience as I did, you know, where postmodern art, so to speak, was revered and encouraged. So in terms of Jonathan's remedy for postmodern art and for the political intersectional stuff, he's saying let them just bring themselves down. These theoretical abstractions don't adhere to any kind of structure, so they're not solid. They're going to disintegrate. And eventually they're just going to turn around on themselves. They're going to turn themselves around and form, and a natural hierarchy will take over. They will eventually be taken over by hierarchy emerging, which is the pattern, which is the way reality is. A hierarchy emerges. The hierarchy may be different from the previous hierarchy. In fact, it's likely going to be. It's going to be something new and fresh, and that will emerge. So let them just duke it out. It's going to flip. When it becomes too chaotic, it's going to go in a different direction. This is actually a tenet of dynamical systems theory, of chaos theory. When things get too chaotic, they flip. So that's interesting. But at any rate, in this chaos, something of quality will be reborn. And this is promised. This is the pattern. And you don't need to be a Christian to see that this eternal pattern is a promise, so to speak. And Christ promised to return. So let me just describe briefly a pattern in the metaphysics of quality. When a pattern is no longer dynamic, it will die or transform, and a new pattern will emerge. So that's that lines up a lot with what Jonathan says. So the last thing I want to talk about is something. Paul VanderKlay did a great video on Owen Barfield. And he goes back into discussing what we discussed, which is the idea of everything in the universe driving towards quality or towards freedom. And this is a fascinating idea. And you know what that means? That means everything is alive, even though we don't describe that being alive in the narrow way we describe what it means to be alive. The metaphysics of quality states that everything is necessarily related, that it just goes along a continuum, the undifferentiated aesthetic continuum. And this idea is perpetually fresh because it's describing the underlying substrate of experience. So let me conclude with a little gift. This is from the guys at South Park, pertaining to the great Alan Watts.
Look. Here is a tree in the garden, and every summer it produces apples. And we call it an apple tree, because the tree apples. That's what it does. Now here is a solar system inside a galaxy, And one of the peculiarities of this solar system is that at least on the planet Earth, the thing peoples. In just the same way that an apple tree apples. Now, maybe 2 million years ago, somebody came from another galaxy in a flying saucer and had a look at the solar system, and they looked it over and shrugged their shoulders and said, just a bunch of rocks. And they went away. Later on, maybe 2 million years later, they came around and they looked at it again. And they said, excuse me, we thought it was a bunch of rocks, but it's peopling. And it's alive. After all, it has done something intelligent. Because, you see, we grow out of this world in exactly the same way that the apples grow on the apple tree. If evolution means anything, it means that. But you see, we curiously twist it. We say, well, first of all, in the beginning, there was nothing but gas and rock. And then intelligence happened to arise in it, like a sort of fungus or slime on the top of the whole thing. But we're thinking in a way, you see, that disconnects the intelligence from the rocks. Where there are rocks, watch out. Watch out, because the rocks are going eventually to come alive.
So I hope that made sense, and I'll see you next time.